we've allowed China to build up a significant, if not an equal capability, potentially even a more advanced capability than ours, for the singular purpose of trying to take Taiwan, right? The balance of power has shifted, where for much of the last century, really since the establishment of the PRC in 1949, China did not have the ability to invade Taiwan, certainly with the United States interfering. They're getting close to having that capability soon. We are on a path to war, quite likely, and we have not yet internalized this.
This is a conversation with Dmitri Alpetrovitch. Dmitri is a chairman of a Washington-based think tank called Silverado Policy Accelerator and an author of a new book called World on the Brink about how to win the new Cold War with China and how to prevent a Cold War from turning into a hot one. We talked about who's winning the Cold War of the 21st century so far, why Taiwan is the new West Berlin, whether Xi Jinping will decide to invade or not, and much, much more. Thank you to everyone who's supporting this podcast on Patreon, and if you enjoy what I do, consider becoming a supporter. These interviews take a lot of time and effort to prepare, record, and edit, and by becoming a supporter, you help me to make this sustainable. And in return, you get full ad-free interviews, bonus content, and you can ask your questions to my future guests. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, you wrote a book in which you argue that we're basically in Cold War 2.0, and you present policies on how which we can win, or the U.S. can win, what you describe as a new race for a global dominance. And I think a good way to start would be by looking at where we are in this race between the US and China right now. So if we're in the Cold War 2.0 already, in your view, how is the US doing, and who is winning the new Cold War?
It's a great question. So, and by the way, I call it Cold War Roman numeral 2, not 2.0, because 2.0 kind of implies that it's a continuation or a new version of the first one, and I think it's quite different, similar to the way World War I was very different from World War II. But look, I think that the U.S. has all the advantages and all the capabilities to win this new Cold War and avoid a hot war, which obviously needs to be a critical component of that, because in many ways China is much weaker than the Soviet Union was. It's weaker militarily. It has a weaker system of friends and alliances, much weaker than the Soviet Union. It doesn't have the ideological strength that the Soviet Union had, or the global power projection. And I think even on the technological race, we have incredible advantages. We have, I identify in the book that in addition to the critical component of the Cold War, which is deterring a conflict over Taiwan, you also need to win a technological race, and you need to win it in 4 areas. You need to win in AI and autonomy, probably self-explanatory for people that have been watching the developments in that space, that I think is going to be really groundbreaking over the medium to long term, and impacting so many industries. And we're clearly leading in that space. All the major, most advanced models are coming from the United States and American companies. The chips that you need to train and run these models are being designed by American companies, even if they're produced in Taiwan. China is far behind. You also need to win in biotech and synthetic biology. It is going to be, I think, an incredibly revolutionary area over coming decades, in part enabled by AI, not just in the medical sciences space, where there's a lot of exciting new treatments and developments that you're seeing, but also in the area of the synthetic biology, being able to use the lab to manufacture new materials, you manufacture potentially even new sources of energy. Really exciting stuff. I think it's some decades away, but certainly something that is almost certainly going to come this century. And in part because of our dominance in AI, but also the lead that we've established in those areas, we're leading there as well. The third one is space, and you've seen over the last 2 decades the really amazing revolution that's taken place in the area of space lift, the reusable rockets invented by SpaceX, that have brought so much more satellite capacity to particularly low Earth orbit, but also the development of these miniature satellites, these CubeSats and bigger satellites that are changing the entire model of how we deploy these things into space. It used to be that you would spend $1 billion building this massive school bus size satellite. You send it into geo orbit, and it would take a long time to build it and design it, costs a lot of money, but also would be incredibly vulnerable to jamming, to destruction with anti-satellite weapons and the like. And now you have constellations of thousands of these things that you keep sending up almost every month, much more resilient, and in low Earth orbit, much better suited for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, being able to track what's happening on Earth, both for military purposes as well as economic purposes, communications with Starlink in particular, revolutionizing that and giving access to high-speed communications in virtually any place on Earth. Even navigation is becoming more resilient because you're no longer relying on a couple dozen satellites with GPS, but you could have thousands of them that are providing that type of service. So really remarkable stuff. We're leading there quite significantly as well. The Chinese are desperately trying to catch up, but timing really matters a great deal because space is limited. There's only so much space in space, and particularly in low Earth orbit. And the projections are you'll have about 50,000 satellites in low Earth orbit by the end of the decade. If China doesn't get its act together soon, it will not have much of a capability to send these global satellite constellations up because of interference issues, both signal interference, but also just physical interference when you have so much stuff up there. So we're leading that area as well. And the fourth area is green energy, as the world is transitioning to a net zero economy and moving off fossil fuels to solar, wind, nuclear, battery technology, etc. And we're losing badly in that one area, right? Not necessarily because we don't have the innovation. There are some really remarkable companies in the space in the US and Europe doing some great stuff on modular nuclear reactors, new types of batteries. But Chinese, because of their overcapacity and subsidization and theft of IP, have just absolutely dominated that space. And we're now trying to desperately correct. The Biden administration announced in May tariffs that will go on Chinese EVs and batteries and some of the components that go into that as well. Really, really important to level the playing field. But 3 out of 4 is not bad. And then you also have 2 critical components that you need to build those 4 technologies, and they're semiconductors and critical minerals. And there it's a mixed bag. On semiconductors, we've got all the leverage, and we've got the ability to both design them. Much of the design happens in the United States. We've got the ability to produce them, both us and our allies. We have some fab manufacturing capabilities, about 10 to 15% of the world's capabilities. Obviously, Taiwan is a big player here. South Korea is a big player. Europe, Japan, Israel, and others. And in advanced space, we've managed to curtail China's ability to produce at scale large numbers of advanced chips because of export controls we've instituted on equipment going to China. Basically, there's export controls that prevent them from buying equipment that you use exclusively to produce chips below 18 nanometers. There are holes in that regime because it is not controlled dual-use equipment. So equipment that you could use, for example, to produce 22 nanometer chips, but also 7 nanometer chips are completely allowed. And in fact, that's exactly what the Chinese have done, is managed to adopt that and produce some of those 7 nanometer chips. Not at huge yields, not at huge scales, and they're more costly, but nevertheless, they're subsidizing it, so it matters a little bit less. They'll probably be able to even get to 5 nanometers, probably not lower than that anytime soon because of the technology limitations, but we haven't done a good job of curtailing that industry completely, and we can, because the other leverage point we have is that the advanced equipment that you need to manufacture virtually any type of semiconductor chip, both advanced and what I call foundational, is made by 3 countries. It's made basically by Netherlands, a company called ASML. It's made by companies in America, Applied Materials, Lam, KLA, and it's made by a couple of companies in Japan as well. Some of the components are made by companies in Germany as well. But basically, all of our allies coming together can basically kneecap the Chinese semiconductor industry if we want to. And I would argue that we do want to, but we haven't yet done it, but we could. And on critical minerals, we're losing badly as well, but not because we don't have the resources. In fact, mining resources available throughout the world, including the United States, for a variety of these minerals, whether you're talking about rare earths or you're talking about lithium, or cobalt, nickel, a range of these minerals. But much of the processing, for some of them, as much as 90%, happens in China, primarily because of subsidies and overcapacity. And again, belatedly, but nevertheless, we're trying to rectify that. And the Biden administration also announced tariffs on some of those critical minerals from China from coming in to level the playing field and allow us to invest in our own processing capability. Luckily, processing minerals is nowhere near as complicated as, let's say, manufacturing chips. Completely doable, can be done in a couple of years with some investments. So even in the areas where we're losing badly, it's not too late, and we can catch up. And in other areas, we are, I would argue, winning significantly. And the other thing that's really great still is the talent base that United States and Europe as well still remain the beacon of opportunity for the world. Right? We have every day, by numbers as recently as a month or two ago, from the Department of Homeland Security, about 4,000 Chinese nationals trying to cross our border, southern border, every single day illegally. Now, I'm not endorsing that, and I think that we need to have a control of our borders and a sane immigration policy, which we don't have today. But it tells you something that so many Chinese are trying to flee China and come here. Right now, some of them are probably coming for nefarious purposes. Some of them are probably agents of the intelligence services, but the vast majority of them are probably just looking for a better life for themselves and their children. And there's virtually no one that wants to jump over the fence and get into China except the North Koreans, and even they're just using it as a transit point on the way to South Korea, right? So that tells you something about the attractiveness of our systems versus theirs and the advantages that we have. And the reason why I think that we are in a very dangerous period right now is because we've taken our eye off the ball. And particularly in the military domain, we've allowed China to build up a significant, if not an equal capability, potentially even a more advanced capability than ours, for the singular purpose of trying to take Taiwan, right? The balance of power has shifted, where for much of the last century, really since the establishment of the PRC in 1949, China did not have the ability to invade Taiwan, certainly with the United States interfering. They're getting close to having that capability soon, or at least putting into question our ability to defend Taiwan. And we need to rectify it as quickly as possible to restore deterrence, to restore that balance of power. And if we do that and we win the technological race, I think the century can be ours. We can win the second Cold War like we won the first one without a hot conflict. So the advantages there. The big question mark, I guess, is do we have the will to use those advantages?
You've mentioned a lot of things that I would like to follow up on, but first, first of all, I wanted to get back to the one of the first things that you've said, that China is a much weaker opponent than the Soviet Union used to be, and you sounded pretty sure about it, and I think that's interesting because you could make the argument that China does have a lot of advantages that the Soviet Union didn't have. Whether we were talking about the population size and the advantage it has over the US in that sphere, or the fact that it doesn't really have the ideology, so it's not burdened down by it, or that economically probably it's a lot more competitive than the USSR used to be. So, would you say that any of those factors might play in China's favor, or they don't actually matter that much?
No, they do. I mean, the population matters, although that population is in decline, right? And precipitous decline and is aging. So that advantage is eroding. They're going to go from 1.4 billion people roughly that they have right now to, conservatively speaking, 550 million by the end of the century, collapse that no one has ever seen. And it's going to have huge ramifications, not just for their economy, but their society, right? We truly unprecedented in history, and much of it will be older and will have healthcare issues and the like. Um, China is powerful economically and much more integrated with the world than the Soviet Union was, but it doesn't have the alliance blocks, right? It doesn't have the Warsaw Pact. It doesn't have uh, really the appeal of its ideology that the Soviet Union had, and the rest of the world really rallying to its cause. In fact, China is pushing much of the world away, and particularly in its region, because of its wolf warrior diplomacy and aggressive actions it has taken in South China Sea and East China Sea and elsewhere. So I think for those reasons, much weaker military and much weaker ability to confront the United States in the rest of the world. I talk about how the balance of power in the Taiwan Strait is shifting, but it really is not shifting anywhere else. If you had a hypothetical matchup, military matchup between the United States military and China's anywhere in the world, Atlantic Ocean or Africa or whatever, you could pick your place. It wouldn't even be close, right? China just wouldn't be able to even deliver its forces at scale to those places, support them logistically and so forth, right? They've built the capability for this one mission. That was not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was playing everywhere, right? In Africa and Latin America and Afghanistan, East Asia. So China is much, much weaker on almost every level. And there are a few areas where it obviously is not. But even on the economic front, things are not going well for them. They've hit the middle income trap way too soon before they became really a rich country, and the growth is stagnating. That growth now is about what it is here domestically in the United States, about 3 to 4%. The economy is 25% smaller, so at that rate, they'll never catch up with us. And they've got a huge property bubble, a banking crisis. They just had a big bank fail this very week. So things are not going well. And again, when I look at where most of the innovation is coming from, where is the greatest access to capital, where are the best companies being built and operated, it's not in China.
I agree completely that China definitely does have a bit of a self-defeating strategy in actually antagonizing countries instead of turning them into allies. But it does, and I'm skipping ahead here a little bit, it does have a few friends, and there's is this axis that's being mentioned more and more frequently of you could call them maybe China's allies, Russia, Iran, North Korea, that are all linked together by their basically attempt to rewrite the international order. Do you think that could substitute the alliances that China doesn't have, or that this importance of this bloc is maybe tends to be maybe overblown?
Yeah, I think it's overblown quite a bit. And let me address it piece by piece. So, first of all, Iran, China do not have a really, really deep relationship, right? In fact, China is balancing out its relationship in the Middle East with UAE and Saudis and others. So, they're not all in on Iran. North Korea, they've always had a very complicated relationship with North Korea because North Korea never wants to have a single sponsor. Throughout its whole history, even during the first Cold War, they've always been trying to balance between the Soviet Union and China and kind of try to sometimes antagonize each side equally so that they would never be reliant on one or the other and play one off each other. In fact, right now, you've had Putin declare this military alliance with North Korea, essentially an Article 5 type of self-defense, mutual self-defense treaty with North Korea. Not something that I think is pleasing a lot of people in Beijing right now, and I think that's intentional. And with Russia itself, even though they've rhetorically said that they have a friendship without limit, which they actually haven't repeated since 2022 when it was first made, it's very clear that it has dramatic limits. In fact, it is full of limits. So even though the pictures are great for Putin, where she's bear hugging him whenever he sees him, he's actually getting very little from him, right? He's not getting military aid. Even on the dual use technologies that he's getting, the Chinese are curbing some of that exports. The Chinese banks are very concerned about sanctions and are stopping payments to Russia in certain cases. So this is at best a half-hearted attempt to actually help Russia, and certainly not on the scale of what Iran or North Korea are doing, which is very striking. And even when you look at the summit that they had in May in Beijing, where Putin clearly had very high expectations. He brought basically like all of the Russian government, most of the oligarchs in charge of the economy with him, enormous delegation, and yes, had great pictures and drinking together and toasting and so forth. But then when they released the communique, the public communique, and I'm sure there are private pieces as well that maybe go a little bit further and give them something. But Putin also wanted a PR win, particularly on the economic front of how China is going to invest in the Russian economy and help them out. He got none of that. The first item in the communique said how great the friendship is and unbreakable friendship between the Chinese and Russian people. Okay, great. Second item said that they're going to establish a zone for the protections of leopards and tigers in the border between China and Russia and Siberia. Wow. Well, I'm glad that they're saving tigers and leopards, but it's probably not the number one issue in the Chinese or Russian national security apparatus right now. The third item in the communique talked about how they're going to align veterinarian standards to make it easier to transfer pets between those two countries, right? So very, very clear that China basically gave Putin very little of anything on substance. Maybe there's some covert protocols providing some additional military aid, but certainly on the economic front and the wins that Putin wanted to announce when he brought all these people over did not materialize. So it's way overblown. It's not an alliance. It's certainly not a military alliance. And in fact, when you look at the cyber domain, the numerous number of attacks that Russia is seeing right now against its networks are coming from China and vice versa. So there is no trust lost between them, right? You look at the alliance that the United States has with these so-called Five Eyes countries, UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. There's not just an alliance to share intelligence. There's an alliance not to do espionage against each other, right? A unique one in history. China doesn't have any of that with any of its neighbors, and in fact, routinely does intrusions against Iran, against Russia, and they reciprocate in kind when they're able to. So very much overblown in terms of the capabilities. And you look at the Soviet Union. I mean, not only did the Soviet Union not have espionage being done against them by the Poles or the Czechoslovakians. I mean, they controlled those intelligence services. They controlled those militaries, right? China doesn't have any of that.
So I think if we're talking about the Cold War analogies, because I think it's really interesting to compare the situation that we're now in today with the one that we've used to be in. You made the analogy between Taiwan today and the Cold War Berlin back then, and I think that it's not just my opinion, but basically the fact that the US managed to deter Soviets from taking West Berlin back then, and the fact that we've managed to go on for 40 years without the Cold War ever turning into a hot war in Europe. Looking back, that's kind of a miracle. And if Taiwan is the West Berlin of today or Berlin of today, how do we achieve the same outcome? Because I guess that maintaining status quo with Taiwan would already be a victory. That's kind of what we should be hoping for.
Absolutely. I think a status quo is a victory. It's been our policy for the last 45 years, since 1979, when we said we're not for Taiwan declaring independence, but we're also opposing a forceful takeover of Taiwan. Now, we're unclear about whether we would defend Taiwan or not. We have made no such commitment, but we're clearly, from a policy perspective, have always opposed a forceful change to the status quo. And being able to preserve that would be a huge victory. Just like in the West Berlin analogy, we preserved West Berlin. We did not argue that we should unify West and East Berlin, and East Berlin should become democratic. We ultimately got to that point, but we were not forcefully trying to change the status quo, right? And the most critical piece of that was a commitment to defend West Berlin. I write about the summer of 1961, which I think is so underappreciated in the study of the Cold War and the riskiest moments of the Cold War, because everyone's sort of focused on the 13 days in October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there's unquestionably a dangerous moment when the two superpowers could have gone into a nuclear conflict. But it was 13 days. And by the way, for much of those 13 days, American public wasn't even aware that this was happening, because it took a while for Kennedy administration to come out publicly with it. In 1961, it was the entire summer. In fact, much of that year, when Kennedy goes into that year, obviously just getting elected, the first thing that happens is the Bay of Pigs disaster. And he wants to have a better relationship with the Soviet Union. He writes a letter to Khrushchev, asking for a summit, wanting to have a detente and basically say that we should not be on this confrontational path. And they meet in Vienna in June of 1961, and Khrushchev wants none of that. And he's singularly focused on this issue of West Berlin. He gives an ultimatum that either you withdraw or I'll invade. And Putin, not Putin, Kennedy is completely shell shocked, right? He does not expect this. He's convinced that Khrushchev is basically a madman, that this is insane. But he gets his spine into him and he says, no, we're not going to let this happen. And he goes on American television and he warns the public that we are going to defend West Berlin, which, by the way, was a lot less defendable from a military standpoint than Taiwan. It is surrounded by East Germany. The Soviets, if they were to invade, would have completely overwhelmed any resistance there. But Kennedy says we're going to defend it at all costs, even at a risk of nuclear conflict. And in fact, warns the American public to prepare for nuclear war. He asked Congress to allocate money for looking into fallout shelters around the country. I mean, just incredibly dangerous period, playing out over weeks and weeks and weeks, not just 13 days in October of 1962. And it culminates in mid-August, at the end of that summer, where Kennedy is woken up one day and has been told that Khrushchev blinked and that East Germans are building the wall, and he celebrates that, right? And remarkable, in retrospect, because 25 years later, you have President Reagan showing up at the wall saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. But Kennedy says, thank God. Thank God he's building the wall because it means he's not invading. And it was really the end of Soviet expansionism in Europe. It was both a symbolic end and a very physical end of it. And he said, it's not a great solution, but it's better than war. And we've had stability after that moment through much of the rest of the Cold War, barring the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later, which was an outgrowth really of the West Berlin crisis, because Khrushchev saw that he lost face in that conflict. He was actually convinced, as we now know from a great book by my friend Sergei Radchenko, Cold War historian, that looked at the declassified archives from the Communist Party, that one of the reasons why Khrushchev put missiles on Cuba is not because he wanted to have an offensive capacity against the United States, but because he feared that Kennedy, especially emboldened by what he viewed as a victory over West Berlin, where he made Khrushchev basically back down, would try to take Cuba again. Complete miscalculation. After obviously the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was completely uninterested in any attempts to take Cuba, but Khrushchev really feared that, and he wanted to put missiles on Cuba to deter that invasion, and also not to lose face further with the Chinese. They were on his toes for leadership amongst the communist world. And you had the Cuban Missile Crisis. But after that, the Cold War stabilized. In the 1970s, you were able to get to detente, arms control agreements, and none of that would have happened, I argue, if you didn't have the Berlin Wall and a stabilization of that confrontation that existed for the first 15 years of the Cold War, since the Berlin airlift and throughout the 1950s until 1961. So having, obviously, a metaphorical wall across the Taiwan Strait, not arguing for a real one, is vital to restore that balance of power that we've had with the Chinese since 1979, where no one was afraid that they would invade Taiwan because they didn't have the capability to do so. And we had a very productive relationship. Now they took advantage of it. And I argue that we need a much more balanced economic relationship, and we need to confront their aggressive actions and against our allies like the Philippines and others in South China Sea. But all of that can be managed if you can avoid the scenario of invasion, and if you can restore the balance of power where it's once again impossible for them to invade.
Well, let's look at that, because I guess if we're going to continue the analogy, we're now in the pre-blinking moment when China is in the expansionist phase, and she has given the order that the military should be prepared to invade Taiwan by 2027. And whether they'll do it or not is a question, but we're definitely not in the stabilized period yet, and we'd like to get there. So I think on that note, it's interesting because you were one of the, I would say, relatively few people who did manage to correctly predict that Putin will invade Ukraine in 2022. And I wonder if we're going to move to the issue of Taiwan contingency now, if you apply the same analytical framework and you look at maybe the same long-term indicators that you were looking at with Russia and you apply it for China and Taiwan, how likely, in your opinion, do you assess the threat of invasion of Taiwan in the short to mid-term future?
Yeah, I think 2028 through 2032 is really that very dangerous window. And the reason I think that is, he's not ready to invade today. We know that not just by analytically looking at their capabilities, but also because he's given that order to be ready by 27, which, by the way, they may not meet, right? Just because you give any government agency in any country an order to be ready by a certain time frame doesn't mean that they actually will be. By the way, 27 I think is an interesting year because what is happening in 27? Well, he's up for re-election with the Chinese Communist Party, and I'm certain that one of the reasons he's given the order to be ready by 27 is not that he wants to invade in 27. I think it's a really bad year for him to invade, but because he wants to be able to go up in front of that Congress in October or November of 2027 and say, look at what I've accomplished. It's the 100th year anniversary of the PLA, the establishment of the military for the Communist Party, and we're now ready whenever we want to do this. Doesn't mean that he'll be ready to do it, politically at that moment, but he wants to be able to say it, take credit, and certainly make it easier for him, even easier to get a new term. But once he gets past that election, once he gets past the first half of 2028, which is really going to be all consuming in terms of new people coming in, filling the positions, new ideologies being set for the next 5 years and all that, which, takes a lot of effort. So not a great time to launch invasion. But you get past all that and the window really, I think, opens. And by the way, he is no longer going to be distracted, while we will be very distracted, both the Taiwanese and us, because 2028 is the year of the Taiwanese election. In January of that year, both legislative and presidential, potentially a new president that could be inaugurated in May of that year. So transition, or even if it's the same president, certainly a new team coming in. Uh, in the summer of that year, you have the Los Angeles Olympics, which are going to be all consuming for the American public. And then you have our own elections that fall, which could lead to a lame duck presidency and so forth, right? So you really have an opportune time, I think, for him, and a not so opportune time for us in Taiwan that could politically trigger him to move forward. And then I think in 2032 it could close because he is going to be at the end of that term, and he's going to be also 79. Unlike our system and their system, they don't tend to elect their leaders into their 80s. So he may be looking at the end of his position in power, at least direct position in power. And I think just like Putin, he really wants to do it on his own watch. It's not enough for him to think that China one day will take Taiwan and achieve the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, as he calls it. He wants to be the one to get credit for it. He wants to get down into the pantheon of Chinese history as the leader that's greater than Mao, that did the one thing that Mao could never do. And that's why I think that timing could be really important. And the other element of this is that the longer he waits, the worse it gets, because we've woken up now and we're investing heavily in the Indo-Pacific as part of the supplemental that provided aid to Ukraine this spring. We also provided billions both for Taiwan as well as our own capabilities in the region. Taiwan is investing heavily. Japan is investing heavily. Philippines is investing heavily. So the longer you wait, that balance of power starts to shift back yet again, right? And things get much worse for him if he waits too long into the 2030s, certainly in 2040s. So that window will close, and he needs to take advantage of it if he's ever going to do it. And he knows that politically, there's no way to achieve unification with Taiwan, I believe, without the use of force, because the Taiwanese have no appetite for unification. About 7% in the latest polls support any unification. That's been going down steadily for decades now. And even though 7%, it's a question of what they actually believe, because many of them probably think that unification means that they take over the mainland, the position of the KMT party, the nationalists, for many, many decades. So that's just not going to happen. I think a blockade scenario doesn't work either. I write about that both in the book and recent piece in War on the Rocks of why it would fail. And I think that if he's going to do it, he needs to do a full-scale invasion. And if he doesn't do it by early 2030s, mid 2030s at the latest, that window closes.
You seem to be sort of echoing what I've heard from quite a lot of China experts, including people who actually live in China. And that's that basically, in the end, it's going to come down to a decision of a single person, of Xi, and how much he wants to uh, leave his legacy in form of a Taiwan, how much he wants to change history, and whether he wants to take that risk or not. So, what's your read on that? What's your read on him in that matter?
No, absolutely. I think he wants to do it. I don't even think that. I mean, he's clear on that, right? He talks about this and very publicly, and the Chinese various Chinese officials do as well. That this is inevitable. This is going to happen, and he also talks quite a bit that this is a problem, quote unquote, problem of Taiwan can be passed on to the next generation. Well, he's in his 70s, so what does he mean the next generation, right? For him, the next generation means quite a bit different than you and me. So I think the timeline is top of his mind. He believes that this is the cornerstone of Chinese nation's rejuvenation. So he's not focused that much on the economy. A lot of these people that they're saying, oh, he's going to look at the risks to his economy because of sanctions or export controls that can be ensued on China. If he even believes that that would happen, because China is certainly not Russia, and it's a lot harder to uh, do that sort of thing to China in terms of economic blowback than on Russia. And he's not going to do it. The argument goes because of those fears. Well, he seems completely uninterested in economics. He's preoccupied with national security. Right now, Chinese economy is not doing well. Is he doing bailouts? Is he focused on the economic issue day in, day out? No. What is he doing? He's picking a fight with the Philippines, trying to resupply this World War II era ship that they grounded on a shoal in South China Sea. He's not giving huge bailouts to the economy. He's seems ideologically opposed to that. Right. This is a man that's focused on legacy, on power, on hardcore national security, control of the population. Not the one that seems obsessed with making the Chinese economy the best in the world.
I think that's an excellent point, because it does seem that she has almost given up on the economic side of the equation, and he just doesn't care that much about it anymore.
I think he actually doesn't understand economics. I think he's bored by it. You see this in the decisions he's made with regards to personnel, that he is basically gotten rid of anyone that understands economics on the Politburo. He's replaced them with loyalists that are hardcore power focused officials. And he wants, of course, a better economy for China. I mean, who wouldn't, wanted that for their country? But he just doesn't understand it. I think he's bored by it, much like Putin, by the way, who basically says to his economists and Ministry of Finance officials, you manage the economy, I manage other things, right? And I mentioned this episode in the book that was retold to me by someone who was in Russia at the time, has since left, but was very well connected. And they said, in 2014, when he wanted to take Crimea, Putin, a bunch of these economists, central bankers were freaking out and saying, "Oh my God, this will be devastating to the Russian economy. There'll be sanctions. We shouldn't do this." And he said, "My job is to focus on expanding Russian power. Your job is to manage the economy. You do your job, I'll do mine." And I think she is thinking very much the same way, that anyone that's going to come to him and say, this conflict over Taiwan is going to be really bad for us economically, like we shouldn't do it, he'll say, "That's your job. You do it."
I think Putin is lucky in that way, that he actually has very competent people who are working for him, who do work on the economic side of things. But I think, listening to you, it sounds like you think that she is pretty determined to do it. And I wonder if you think that he can be even deterred, or whether focusing on deterrence is actually the right mindset to have here, and whether it might not be better to just accept that there's a increasingly likely chance that it's going to happen, and the US might be better off preparing for when it happens rather than trying to deter it.
Well, look, I think it's not predetermined. I don't think he's penciled a date certain in his calendar yet, and he's got questions. And you see him purging leadership, both defense ministers as well as generals in his rocket forces, because he's seen corruption, he's seen the level of preparedness he's not satisfied with, and he's trying to change that, right? So there's real doubts I think he still has, but his capabilities, and because he's given the order to be ready by 27, the implication is that he thinks they're not ready right now, right? So that's important, and the more doubt we can introduce, the more dilemmas we can create for him, the better off we'll be. And yes, I think we should absolutely try deterrence, because there are three outcomes here, right? China invades and wins and takes Taiwan. China tries to take Taiwan and loses, or China doesn't invade. The last one is the one that we all should want, because the other two, obviously, it's better if they lose, but they're going to be disastrous economically, lives lost. It is going to be a catastrophe for America, for China, for the rest of the world. No one is going to be untouched by this. So we should focus on deterrence. Can we succeed? Who knows? Like it is the decision of one person, and it's fundamentally unmeasurable. I argue in the book that because the stakes are so high for us, we need to do what we do in other cases where deterrence is vital, particularly nuclear, which is we need to do it all, right? And go overboard. And you look at the nuclear deterrence sphere, right? We could say that having about 400 nuclear warheads stationed in silos across the Midwest is sufficient to deter anyone from striking the United States and have retaliatory capabilities to destroy them, right? And we shouldn't do anything else. But we don't say that. We say, no, we're going to have submarines that are capable of launching missiles, nuclear armed missiles. You have bombers that can deliver warheads. Even though that's incredibly involved, incredibly expensive, we're going to do it all because we want to make sure that no one has any doubt that we can retaliate against them, right? Similarly, with Xi, I think we need to do it all. We need to do the military deterrence, we need to do economic deterrence, diplomatic deterrence, to create as many doubts as possible for him that this can succeed. And the one key difference between him and Putin and the invasion of Ukraine and Taiwan is that the stakes for Xi are really dire in case of failure, which they're not for Putin. I've argued since the beginning of this war that Putin can declare victory tomorrow because his goals are so nebulous, right? Denazification, demilitarization, what does that even mean? He could literally say tomorrow, mission accomplished, we're pulling out, we're done, and no one in Russia would bat an eye, and his position in power would be very secure. That's not true with Xi. The goals are very clear. You either take Taiwan or you don't. They're binary. And if you fail, the consequences for you personally are quite dire. The Communist Party itself can collapse as a result of this, right? So because the stakes are so high, he needs to be pretty certain that he can succeed before he does it, which is why, by the way, he hasn't yet done it. And you can try to increase that through every level of power you have. Will you succeed? I don't know. No one knows, right? But we have to try, because the ramifications, if we don't, are catastrophic.
I think that you, in your view, one of the key points of deterrence is being firm, as in the analogy with Kennedy and Soviets. It's about not blinking and not backing down, because that's a sign of weakness. But there is an argument to be made that if by wanting to do that, you get too aggressive on China, even before we get to the hot war, you could actually escalate the situation in turn by being too hawkish and maybe too tough, rather than giving some concessions. I wonder if what's your view on that?
Well, I don't know which concessions you'd give, because there's only one they'd want, which is for us to give them Taiwan, which we're not going to be willing to do. But look, I'm not for an aggressive rhetorical posture that is not backed up by force. I would rather take the Teddy Roosevelt approach of speak softly and carry a big stick. So for me, first and foremost, it's fundamental to have the military capability to deter this invasion, to make it very clear to Xi that if he tries that, he will lose. Secondly, we need to have the economic leverage to tell him that we are going to institute incredibly painful ramifications if you try this, and we're going to try to leverage as much as possible from Chinese economy in critical areas to make sure that we have the the ability to convince you that we will actually do this, right? When we actually look at Russia, one of the things that I think has been most misunderstood about our response to Russia is that there are actually very few sanctions that have been placed on Russia, and mostly just in the military sphere, where it's easy because we don't buy a lot of Russian weapons to begin with, right? And our allies don't. But on the oil sector and the gas sector, very few sanctions because we don't want to damage the world economy and damage us. So in the areas where it matters, we actually have done very little because of the fear of blowback. And it's important to convince China that if they move on Taiwan economically, we will actually do that. And one way to convince them is to figure out a way to limit the damage that would come from that by taking actions early into risking in critical sectors and the like. So it's not about being aggressive rhetorically. I think it's about quietly but confidently building capabilities that we can deter him militarily, economically. It is not about encouraging Taiwan to declare independence, which, by the way, is not the position of any party in Taiwan. So no one is really for that. And it's about preserving the status quo. So I would reassure the Chinese that we're for the status quo, but they're the ones that are trying to change that. They're the ones that are saying, we want to take Taiwan, including by force. And we should say then, no, we're not going to let you do that by force. If you want to do it, try to convince the Taiwanese to join the mainland willingly. I don't think they will, and I think they know they won't. But that's your only option.
Does it still then make sense to have the strategic ambiguity? Wouldn't it be better to just declare outright that if China attacks, the US would defend Taiwan as it did with the Soviet Union and Western Europe? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.